Welcome back, everyone. So we're going to get into part 3 of topic 4, genetic blueprint and energy production. So in this section, we're going to switch gears. So we're pretty much done learning about the structure of DNA and how it's replicated. And so now we're going to switch into energy. So we're going to learn a little bit about how energy, what is energy, and then how that's related to metabolism. So by the end of this video, you should be able to describe the flow of energy from the sun to animals. You should also explain why all cells need energy and explain the difference between kinetic and potential energy, as well as describe the relationship of ATP to activation energy. So let's start out by talking about how energy and metabolism is related. So first off, let's take a look at this figure over here on the right. So basically, energy is flowing through our living system. So we get all the energy that is inside your body now originated from the sun. So sunlight, that light energy from the sun was transferred into chemical energy from our plants. So plants, they photosynthesize, so they took energy from the sun to convert carbon dioxide and water into sugar in the form of glucose and oxygen. And so by eating plants, or by eating animals that ate plants, we were able to harness that energy. Okay, so you can see how energy is transferred through the system, so the living system. So that is called bioengineerics. Okay, so bioengineerics is just that concept of energy flow through living systems. So we can think of it as ourselves, cells. So when we are us as consumers, so we consume our energy. So think of the cells in our body. So our cells in our body are taking in nutrients, and they are breaking the nutrients down in order to get cellular energy. So within our cells, chemical reactions occur. And we can have chemical reactions that either build molecules, okay, or they break down molecules. So, you know, there's either type of reactions that occur. So we can either, you know, undergo like dehydration synthesis reactions where we have monomers that make up polymers, or we can have hydrolysis type reactions, you know, for example, that, you know, use water to break down polymers into monomers. So we have, you know, different types of chemical reactions that are occurring within our cells. And some of those reactions can be spontaneous. So that means that they actually, you know, don't really take energy, but instead they release energy during that process. And usually that form of energy that's released is in the form of heat. Some chemical reactions that are occurring in our body actually require energy. Okay, so you have to use energy in order to drive the chemical reaction. So when we're thinking about all of this, cells, they're constantly undergoing chemical reactions to build or break down molecules. And so cells need to produce more and more energy to replenish their supplies that are used in the energy requiring reactions. Okay, so once energy is converted or used, it gets converted into heat, and then we need more energy to be able to be used for those energy requiring reactions. So cells must be able to produce that cellular energy from chemical energy. And so we're going to, in further videos, talk about cellular respiration and how cells can convert that chemical energy from our food into cellular energy. And basically, when we're talking about all the chemical reactions that occur inside of our cells, including those that consume energy as well as those that generate energy, all of them together is what we call metabolism. Okay, so you might think of metabolism in the terms of, you know, your entire body, whether you have a fast metabolism or a slow metabolism, but basically that's just all the reactions that are occurring in your body. So if you have a fast metabolism, you have lots of reactions occurring in your body, and so what happens? You burn a lot of calories, right? And calories are just a unit of energy. If you have a slow metabolism, which happens when you get older, then you have less chemical reactions occurring in your body, and so you don't require as many calories in your diet, right? So it is all connected. So think of your metabolism as all those chemical reactions occurring. So when we're talking about those chemical reactions, we can think of basically, you know, we're breaking or building molecules within our body. And those chemical reactions, they can be series of events that are, or series of chemical reactions that occur in what we call metabolic pathways. So metabolic pathways, they involve a series of chemical reactions that take some sort of starting molecule and modify it through a series of like chemical reactions that kind of occur to form these metabolic intermediates, which eventually yield a final product. So we might have, for example, like you might have some sort of chemical reaction that breaks down starch into, you know, a smaller molecule of, you know, some sort of disaccharide, and then you might have another chemical reaction that will break the bond that forms the monosaccharide. So that's kind of a metabolic pathway. So you have these, you know, series of chemical reactions that are occurring where you end up with these little intermediates in between until you eventually get that final product. Okay, and each one of those chemical reactions is catalyzed by an enzyme. So what are enzymes? If we go way back into topic 2, we learned that, actually topic 3, enzymes are a type of protein. Okay, so proteins, they, one of our 4 macromolecules of life, proteins, one of their functions is that they are enzymes, which are catalyze reactions. So they actually speed up reactions within the chemical reactions that occur within our bodies. So we have all sorts of enzymes within our bodies. Okay. Now, as far as those chemical reactions or those you know, metabolic pathways that are forming, we can have, you know, 2 general types. Okay, so based on the energy requirements or energy that surrounds them. So in an anabolic metabolic pathway or an anabolic reaction, energy is required. Okay, so this is where we have small molecules are built into large ones. So imagine, you know, you have, you know, these smaller molecules. They could be anything. Okay, they could be, you know, some monosaccharides. They could be you know, different types of nutrients, whatever they are. And in order for them to form bonds, we have to supply some sort of energy. Okay, so that is energy is required to bring them together. So this is an anabolic reaction, all right, or an anabolic pathway. So building polymers requires energy. Okay. The other type of metabolic pathway is called a catabolic pathway or catabolism. And in this case, it's the opposite. So energy is released. So this is where we take large molecules and we break them down into smaller ones. And so by breaking the bonds between the larger molecules, energy gets released. Okay. So one way I remember the difference between catabolism and anabolism, I think of cats, and cats, they break things, right? Because they're full of energy. So they are full of energy and they use that energy to break things. Okay, so that's how I remember. So catabolic reaction, energy is released or used, released to break the bond, or is released, breaking the bonds that hold the molecules together. So it takes those large molecules and breaks them down. Okay, that's the opposite of anabolism, where energy is required to form the bonds between the molecules. Okay, so catabolic, large molecules breaking down, need energy is released from that process. Anabolic, small molecules are built up into larger ones, energy is required. Okay. So we keep talking about energy. Well, what is energy? So energy is the ability to do work or to create some kind of change. Now, one of our properties of life, when we went way back at the beginning of the term in topic 1, we learned that living things, they must obtain energy from their surroundings. Okay, so we have to utilize energy. We get it from our surroundings, and so we have to basically obtain it from somewhere. So plants, where do they get their energy from? They get it from the sun. So they use light energy from the sun, and they can transform that light energy from the sun into chemical energy in the form of sugars. Okay, we can take that chemical energy in the form of sugars, and we can transfer it into cellular energy, which is in the form of ATP. So that chemical energy, which is stored in organic molecules, so think of like the carbohydrates, the sugars, and lipids. So those can be used to undergo cellular respiration, and it's transferred into, which is basically transfers that energy from the bonds that are held together in the sugar molecules. That is going to be released, that energy is going to be released and harnessed to form this molecule ATP. Okay, so ATP is cellular energy. So energy is going to get transformed into ATP. So ATP is a special type of cellular energy. And in the next slide, we'll talk about potential energy and kinetic energy. So kinetic energy is the energy of motion. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about ATP before we get into that. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So adenosine triphosphate. So if we take a look at ATP, ATP is going to be used to power the majority of our energy requiring cellular reactions. So we actually use ATP as our energy source in our bodies. And it's a very useful molecule. It's something that stores energy away, and then when we need that energy, we can undergo a quick reaction, a hydrolysis reaction, okay, which will release energy. Okay, so this is what type of reaction is involved here, where we have we're breaking down ATP. So we're undergoing a catabolic reaction. So remember, catabolic reaction frees energy, so energy is released. So let's just look at this equation here. So here's ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So tri means 3, so it has 3 phosphates. Okay, so we're going to add water. So we undergo a hydrolysis reaction. We're adding water to break the bond between 2 of the phosphates. Okay, so one of the phosphates is going to be separated from the rest of the molecule. And by doing so, by breaking that bond, we're going to free some energy. So energy gets released. So we get that burst of energy. So that is where our cells get that energy. You know, if we need energy for whatever we need to do. Okay, so that's that free energy that can be used. And in a sense, we end up with adenosine diphosphate. So di means two. So now we have a molecule that just has two phosphates instead of three. And then here's the other phosphate. This is a little bit, this type of reaction is useful because it can actually reform very easily back into ATP. Okay, so ATP can reform, so the ADP and the phosphate can reform into ATP through a dehydration synthesis reaction with a little bit of free energy. Okay, and we'll talk about how that occurs. So it's kind of like a what we call energy coupling. So some energy gets released, and then we can actually do another reaction where some energy gets released, and we can use that energy to reform ATP. Okay, so ATP is cellular energy, and we can use that for our energy source to power our cells. So let's take a closer look at ATP, the structure and the function. So let's first of all, if you take a look at the structure, it looks kind of similar to one of our monomers that we talked about. Actually, we talked about DNA and RNA in the last video, right? And DNA and RNA, they're made up of nucleotides that have three parts. They have a sugar, a phosphate, and a nitrogenous base. So hey, that looks like the same thing, right? ATP is basically a nucleic acid as well, and it's classified the same as a nucleic acid. And it is composed of the three parts that a nucleotide is composed of. But it's specifically the nitrogenous base that is attached is adenine. The sugar that's involved is ribose. Okay, so it has an adenine and a ribose. And that ribose is attached to a phosphate. So when we have the one phosphate, it's called adenosine monophosphate. So that's the first phosphate. If we have a second phosphate, then it's adenosine diphosphate. So di means two. Now we have two phosphates. If we have a third phosphate, then you get adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so when we're talking about ATP, we have three phosphate groups attached. When we're talking about ADP, we're talking about just two phosphate groups attached. All right. So ADP, adenosine diphosphate, two groups, and then ATP, we have all three groups attached. So when I talked about in the last slide, when we have ATP and we undergo a hydrolysis reaction, we're breaking that bond. When we break that bond, we have a burst of energy is released. So that free energy gets released, and that's what's powering our cells. Okay, so let's go back into energy again. Okay, so remember, energy is the ability to do work, and so we have basically two types of energy. We have kinetic energy and potential energy. So kinetic energy is energy associated with objects in motion, whereas potential energy is stored energy. Okay. So for example, if we are looking at water behind a dam, okay, that is considered like potential energy because, all of this water, it's not flowing, okay, so it's just, stored energy behind this dam. But the moment, the dam is broken and water is released, suddenly all that energy is in motion. Okay, so that goes from potential energy to kinetic energy. Okay, and then when we break the bonds, energy gets released. Okay, and that gives us that chemical energy that can be used for motion, to work, okay, to do whatever the cell needs to do. Okay, so another example, just to clarify if you get confused with potential energy and kinetic energy. Okay, so potential energy would be like, for example, if you have if you're at the top of a diving board. Okay, at the top of the diving board, you are at the top, you have all the stored energy. And the moment that you dive, you're suddenly moving, so that potential energy is turned into kinetic energy associated with objects in motion. Okay, so when we're talking about chemical energy, food, things like that, that's all potential energy. But when we break the bonds, the energy gets released. That allows us to move. Energy gets turned into kinetic energy. Okay. All right. So now that we know about energy, and we know about chemical reactions, and we know about anabolic versus catabolic reactions and all that fun stuff, we're going to end with activation energy. Now, for any chemical reaction to occur, it doesn't matter if we're talking about anabolic or catabolic or whatever, we need to have a little bit of activation energy to get it started. Okay, so for example, if we have a disaccharide, and it's gonna undergo a hydrolysis reaction to form two monosaccharides. Now, a disaccharide is just going to sit there. It's not going to, spontaneously break into two monosaccharides. I mean, it will eventually, but it'd be like a long time for it to actually, finally do that. So activation energy is the energy that is required to get the chemical reaction going. Okay. So we actually have to have a little bit of input, a small amount of energy inputted in order to get the reaction occurring. Okay, so that energy, that activation energy, can be in two forms. So we can have heat added to the system. So typically if we add heat to a system, it causes those molecules to move around more. And so that could be just enough energy to cause the reaction to occur. Okay. Another form of activation energy is ATP. Okay, so ATP could be just that small amount of energy required to cause that chemical reaction to occur. Okay, so heat energy and ATP are forms of that activation energy to get the reaction to occur. Okay, otherwise it's just going to be stuck here in the reactant side. So we need to have, a little bit of activation energy to get us to react, to end up with the products. Okay. All right. So we're going to end this. Well, we still have a question, but we'll kind of bring it all together with another Amoeba Sisters video that kind of summarizes what ATP is.
ATP. We love it. You'll find ATP in so much of our science art. Whether it's a GIF of a mitochondrion or cell transport, or a comic about cellular respiration or fermentation, you'll see ATP mentioned. So why the big deal? Why is it all over the place? Many times students will get it in their mind that it is an energy currency of some kind. When I first started studying biology, I noticed that in textbooks, it's often represented like the starburst thing or thunderbolt. And I guess in my mind I imagined it was like some big blast of energy to help the cell do things. And by do things, I mean that we need ATP to do many cellular processes. Examples include active transport, such as when a cell is trying to move something against its concentration gradient, or its role in muscle contraction with the actin and myosin cross bridge. We need another video for that. ATP is critical for many types of cell signaling. You need your cells to be able to communicate. Those are all just some examples. But what is ATP? How do we get it? And how does it work? Those are the basics of what we're going to focus on in this short video. So what is ATP? If you remember the 4 major biomolecules, ATP would fit in with nucleic acids. Yes, like DNA and RNA. ATP is a nucleotide derivative, so it has those 3 parts you see in DNA or RNA nucleotides: phosphate, sugar, base, but it actually has 3 phosphates. ATP is short for its full name, adenosine triphosphate. This fancy name is helpful as it tells you that it contains the nitrogenous base known as adenine and 3 phosphates, hence the tri in adenosine triphosphate. Its sugar is ribose. How do you get ATP? All cells need ATP, and so they need processes that can be used to generate it. But the process can differ. It might involve oxygen, such as aerobic cellular respiration. It might not involve oxygen, such as anaerobic respiration or fermentation. During cellular respiration, plants break down the glucose they made from photosynthesis to make ATP. During cellular respiration, animals break down the glucose they consumed to make ATP. And it's not just plants and animals. Bacteria, fungi, protists, and archaea, they all need to make ATP. We have a video on cellular respiration and another one on fermentation that can be helpful to understand the process. But one thing that we do want to mention about making ATP is it's important to understand it is part of a cycle. With the ATP cycle, you have ATP, which can be hydrolyzed, releasing energy and losing one of its phosphates in this process. A process like cellular respiration can provide the energy needed to add a phosphate to ADP in order to regenerate ATP again, which is important as ATP can be used quickly. This brings us to how ATP is able to work. So how does ATP work? It's not just about ATP being hydrolyzed and releasing energy, it's more than that. Okay, honestly, it's more than our short video can go into, which is why we provide some further reading links, but let's look at some basics. So when ATP is hydrolyzed, meaning here it involves the addition of water, it's not really that the bond between the second and third phosphate itself is a super strong bond. It's actually more that the bond between the second and third phosphate contributes to this ATP being unstable. These phosphates with their negative charges don't like being arranged like this. The change from ATP, losing its third phosphate to become the more stable ADP, is an exergonic reaction and releases free energy. A popular example for understanding ATP is to use the spring illustration, like a wire spring. Consider how you might compress the spring. ATP would be modeled by that compressed spring, and then you would let it go until it just goes into this relaxed state, which would be represented by ADP. When ATP is hydrolyzed, if the energy was just released, it will likely not be useful for a cell if it's not actually coupled to something that needs it. Thankfully, the energy release can be coupled to endergonic processes that the cell needs to do. This can occur when the phosphate from the ATP is transferred to a molecule that is going to be acted upon. For example, this cell transport protein here is supposed to move some kind of molecule against its concentration gradient. Recall that if it was passive transport, these molecules would be moving from high to low concentration. But in active transport, thanks to ATP, this protein can move them against the gradient. When the phosphate is transferred to this protein, we say the protein has been phosphorylated. Sounds powerful. We can say in our example that this protein is more reactive and less stable in this form, this phosphorylated intermediate state. When it reverts into its original, more stable shape, it can assist in moving them the other direction. So, from marveling at the beating of a single cilia hair, or chromosomes being separated in cell division, or binding the correct amino acid on the tRNA, I could go on. We hope that little ATP symbol will mean something every time you see it. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
So again, that video kind of gave a good review of not only, the structure of ATP, but its function. So you got, to see, that whole coupling of ATP with other reactions and so forth. So let's end up our part 3 with this question, this review question. So which of the following is a function of ATP? Is it A, provide potential energy for chemical reactions, B, provide activation energy for chemical reactions, or C, provide long-term energy storage? If you chose B, I would agree with you. So remember how either heat energy or ATP provides that activation energy that is necessary for chemical reactions to occur. Okay? All right, so we are done with part 3. So part 3, you should be able to describe the flow of energy from the sun to the animals. You should also be able to explain why all cells need energy and explain the difference between kinetic and potential energy. And finally, you should be able to describe the relationship of ATP to activation energy. So in our next video, we're going to get into how ATP is formed. Okay, so how do we get that energy from like sugars and stuff like that into that ATP molecule. So we're going to do that through, we're going to start out with glycolysis, and then that's the beginning stage of cellular respiration.